Saxony, and I'm head of McLean School. It's really a pleasure to welcome back Dr. Rebecca Resnik to speak with us about such a crucially important topic. I know as a parent how important resilience is in our children and our students, and so really grateful to all of you for coming out and grateful to Dr. Resnik for presenting for us.
Okay. Well, welcome to the last workshop of the series for the parents. And Dr. Resnik has kindly agreed to do a workshop here on resiliency. She's an expert working with children and adolescents. Her practice is Mindwell Psychology in Bethesda. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Resnik.
Okay, so let's see. I think several people were here for Cecily's Advocacy Day. How many people actually sat through my whole? All right, so I can recycle the jokes. Good. So what we're talking about tonight is a related topic. Motivation is actually a much more complicated one. Resilience is a little bit simpler. So the plan is for me to talk for about 45 minutes and then have the last 15 for questions. So again, my name is Rebecca. I'm a licensed psychologist. That's fine for me. Is that all right for you?
Sure.
Okay, great. So we all 10 years younger. So I'm a licensed psychologist. Prior to going back to school to get my psychology degree, I was a special education teacher. And if you ask me which degree was probably more valuable for what I do every day, it's kind of the special ed degree to a large extent. Most importantly, I'm a mother. I have a stepson who's off at college. I have a 7-year-old at Wingate Elementary, and I have a 5-year-old at White Flint Children's House. So I'm in that same trench. And I've come full circle now. My stepson's now 21. I started parenting him when he was about 6.5. So I've had a chance to see everything kind of up close, personal, warts and all. So I try to keep a sense of humor about all of these things. The one thing that I'm never joking about is the rights and dignity of our kid and the rights and dignity of our kids. The rights and dignity of all of us as parents. So we're going to joke because otherwise you're going to fall asleep or start reading your email. But those are the things I'm very serious about. Okay, so having been a special ed teacher, I always do advanced organizers, so this is where we're headed tonight. Do a little bit of neurobiology. I know a lot of people's eyes start to glaze over when I say I'm going to talk about the brain. You're like, okay, I've seen the same brain diagrams, I've heard all of this before. But I'm a big believer in if you know how something works, then you know how to work with it. For example, if you know why you shouldn't overwork pie crust because of the gluten formation, that's very helpful, then you can make a better pie crust. I think kids are kind of the same way. If you understand what's going on with them, then you're in a better position to get the outcome that you want. We'll talk a little bit about the psychology, internal and external factors that influence whether or not a person is resilient, coping with adversity, and teaching kids to persevere. So that's where we're going. And of course, we always have to start out with a definition. If you're a Shel Silverstein fan, you recognize the man in the iron pail mask, which is one of my personal favorites, having been on my 3rd boy. Resilience is essentially the ability to cope adaptively with adversity and stress. And what it basically means is that you can go through a situation that is stressful, that is difficult for you, and come out without anxiety, without depression, making it so that you can't get through your day, that you can't be happy. A lot of us have misconceptions about what it means to be resilient, and there's a Nietzsche quote, "That which does not kill us makes us stronger." I didn't know that was Nietzsche for a long time. I dated a Marine, and he used to say that all the time. So we didn't date for that long. And so a lot of times when you talk to people, you get the idea that the way to make children resilient is to make them tough and aggressive and bold, and to put them in situations where bad things are happening to them. Sort of throw them in the deep end of the pool, and they'll swim eventually, or they won't. I'm not a big believer in this one, because there's certainly many people in the world who've gone through awful situations, and it hasn't made them a better person on the inside. there are a lot of people who are very tough and aggressive, the type of people who could come in here and put me in a headlock too fast to talk about. Or people who are, very, very tough, John Wayne types. But that's not the same as being resilient. I used to teach in an emotionally disabled cluster program, and so I had a lot of tough characters there. I had a lot of kids who had been through the sorts of misery you wouldn't wish on a dog you didn't like. And it didn't make them resilient. As a matter of fact, for all of their bravado on the outside, for all that they were punching and kicking and cussing and calling me all sorts of colorful names, on the inside they were very, very fragile people. So to them, a situation where they weren't completely in control was absolutely intolerable. And as we go through life, we can't be in control of most of the situations. You know this, your parents, right? You're not in control a lot of the time. And that's the kind of thing that we need to get ourselves inoculated against. And here's one of my favorite slides, because Wesley is very nice to look at. This is from The Princess Bride, and I've always thought this quote very telling. It says, obviously, life is pain, Highness. So anyone who says differently is selling something. But what we often try to tell our kids is, this isn't so bad, you're not really hurt, you can do this is easy, you're smart enough to do this. And so a lot of what we do is deny what our kids are actually feeling. And we don't validate it, and we basically tell them that whatever they're feeling and thinking about a situation is incorrect. And part of developing resilience is getting in touch with what you feel and why, and really recognizing it. That helps us become resilient. And it's always an interesting question, who is resilient? Who are these people who can go through horrible situations in their lives and come out okay, and come out with their hearts intact, and still loving other people, and still having hope, still being effective and just getting through their day? And so we have Malala, who was shot in the head, Anne Frank, obviously Dr. Martin Luther King, everyone's going to recognize. And this fellow is the one who was singled out. He's an Army Ranger. He was sitting next to Michelle Obama during the State of the Union address. The guy was basically, his body will never be the same again. But his theme was that he's not giving up, and he's still contributing and able to accomplish things in his life. But the interesting question is, why do some of us completely fall apart when small things in our lives happen, while other people can be shot in the head and they're still going strong? And why? It's complicated, and we don't really know for sure. But resilience has a lot to do with the nature and nurture. So it has a lot to do with how we're made and what genetics brings to the table. So this is a guy named Russo, and in his research, he looked at the biochemistry, neurophysiology of why some people are resilient and some aren't. And so what he talked about is there's genetics, things like serotonin level. This is the HPA axis, hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal glands. You know your adrenal glands? If I was to throw a bomb in the middle of this group, everybody's adrenal glands would start sending out a lot of stress hormones. You know that feeling when you get that surge of adrenaline? All of us have different set points for how reactive we are to anxiety and stress. And so it's our body that reacts, and it's our brain. What he also talked about is what he called stress inoculation. Now, stress inoculation is just sort of like vaccination. When we are exposed to a weakened form of a virus, then our body learns to fight it off. And stress inoculation is talking about dealing with small stressors so that we'll be ready to deal with the big ones. Epigenetics, I'm sure there are people in this room who could explain that a lot better than I. That's basically what your genetics from generations past is bringing to the table. But all of these are what we bring as beings to the table. But the brain changes the environment, and the environment changes the brain. And so it's not just a question of genetics, it's also a question of how is our brain constructed as we have experiences every day. One of the things I'm fond of telling teachers is that when you're teaching a child to read, you are literally reshaping their brain. You are sculpting their brain to do something that nature never intended for it to be able to do. And when you see a kid start reading and they go from that frustration point and then they hit that beautiful fluency arc where all of a sudden they're really reading, you've changed their brain. And it will never be the same again. So all of these elements come together to determine how resilient are we in the face of stress. And of course, what it really depends on is how well we can cope. So I know you guys hear a lot about the amygdala. Psychologists love the amygdala. It's the brain's first alarm system. It's the thing inside our brain that goes alert, alert, danger, danger. It's actually named for the word almond, means almond. It's this little thing way down in the oldest part of our brain, way down in the middle. And the amygdala's job is to tag emotions. So when something happens, or to give an emotional tag to information, sorry. So when something happens, if it's good, our amygdala gives it a good tag. We like this, we want more of this. If it's bad, scary, traumatic, our amygdala gives it the tag, stay away from this at all costs. Well, what the amygdala is also responsible for is setting off the body's stress response, setting off that adrenal gland, changing the way the nervous system is functioning so that you can either fight or flight. So what we call this first alarm system, we call this bottom up. So disorders like PTSD are about the amygdala to a large extent because the over-exaggerated stress response is coming from way down here. So information comes from up here and is shot up here to the frontal lobe where the brain makes sense of it. So if I threw a rubber snake at you right now, well, you would probably, like being a guy, be like, oh, a snake. But if someone threw a rubber snake at me, I would be a big girly scream, wah, like that. So my amygdala would react, but then my cortex would come online and say, wait a minute, that's just a rubber snake. But for some of our kids, their cortex doesn't calm them down. It actually feeds that anxiety and makes it worse. Daniel Dennett, the philosopher, he said that the human brain is basically an anticipation machine. And I love that idea. The thing that separates us from any other creature on the planet is that our brain is constantly anticipating what's going to happen and running through all sorts of hypotheses and plans and schemas for what we're going to do. Anyone ever sit there and have that sort of daydream where all of a sudden you're picked to be a backup singer for your favorite, for like Paul Simon? That's never going to happen, but if you give yourself 5 minutes to think about how great that would be, that's your frontal lobes at work. There's no other sorts of beings except human beings on Earth that can do that. The funny thing about dogs, if you want your dog to go into a crate, dog doesn't want to go, you throw a cookie in there, the dog goes, oh, I want a cookie, goes running right into the crate. You can do this 1,000,000 times, and your dog is not going to be able to say, if I go in there, she's likely to close that crate door. They're never going to figure it out. Cats, on the other hand, they know. So what our brain is doing constantly is always trying to think about what's coming, what's likely to happen. What am I going to do if X happens? What am I going to do if Z happens? And when that gets too out of control, that's when we run into anxiety and ruminations. So it's all about this wonderful gift that we have and how our brains work run amok. So what, I'm not going to do that. That's okay. So the real key to understanding why sometimes negative events lead us to become anxious or depressed, it's really all about what we call top-down, meaning that you have the amygdala set off the alarm, danger, 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 bad situation, the teacher's angry at me. The information flows up to the front of the brain. The front of the brain's going to make sense of it. And what sometimes happens is that we have here the anterior cingulate cortex. The anterior cingulate cortex decides in concert with other parts what we're going to pay attention to. And so it fans the flames. And so what happens is we have a normal stress response to a stressful situation, but even after the threat is gone, we can't let it go. And that's what anxiety disorders are all about. A lot of times depression is very closely related to that. We have a bad experience. We overgeneralize. No one's ever going to like me. No one's ever going to want to date me. I'll never get a job. I'll be a total loser living in my parents' basement. All of that has to do with how our brain makes sense of what these lower areas have to say. Michio Kaku is a physicist. If you've ever seen him, he's been on TV a lot promoting his book. He has like this great shock of white hair. He's a really cool looking guy. And he recently wrote a book called The Future of the Mind. If you're interested in brains and futures and technology, fabulous, fabulous book. So it took a physicist to come up with my favorite metaphor for how the brain works. And what Kaku says is that the frontal lobe of the brain is a lot more like a CEO than, you've all heard orchestra conductor, and people pick apart why that's not a great analogy. But I like the CEO. And what he has to say about the CEO is that if you're, say, running an independent school, you're in charge of a whole lot of people, and a whole lot of things are happening. And if you're in charge, you can't pay attention to all of those things. You have to focus on the things that only you can do. And you have to focus on supporting your staff. You also have to take the information that you need to do your job, keep your staff happy, keep your parents happy, keep the donors happy, all those things you have to do when you're running a school. But you cannot pay attention to everything. And what a lot of trouble our kids run into, our kids when they get anxious, when they get depressed, is that their CEO starts focusing on the wrong things, or can't focus on any one thing in particular. So like, I'll be testing a kiddo, they'll be ready to answer a question, and all of a sudden they'll start ruminating about whether or not they're going to get the question right. Can you tell me if this is right? I don't know. I'm not sure I'm going to get this. This one looks really hard, and I think I got the last one wrong, but maybe I could do the next one. All of those automatic negative thoughts, all of those thoughts start getting in the way of that child being able to do what needs to be done. And when it comes down to it, mental health, to a large extent, is being able to do what needs to be done. So all of these areas, when you're talking about the brain as CEO, this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, this is the problem-solving area of the brain. And the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex gets information flooding in all the time, competing for its attention. And the key to good cognitive functioning is to be able to tune out what you don't need. So if you hear a fire drill go off, and you know it's a fire drill, that's not a great time for you to panic and start running outside. There are a lot of things that make some kids vulnerable, and some of these things are just who our kids are, their temperament, their genes, the things that they've learned. Perhaps your child spent the first 2 or 3 weeks of his or her life in the NICU getting tubes pushed down his throat and maybe stopping breathing a lot, maybe having a lot of reflux. A lot of things go into this. And one of the things that makes our kids very vulnerable is what we call rigid coping strategies. Those kids where they come up with one way that they're going to solve the problem, and you can't talk them out of it. They're going to cling very firmly to, there's one way to solve the problem, and I must have my way, and if they don't get their way, the meltdown comes. We'll talk about maladaptive coping strategies, I think, in the next slide. The research also tells us that what makes our kids really vulnerable is not having one big, terrible, stressful event, generally speaking. So what really tends to make our kids vulnerable is chronic stress. A lot of small bad things happening kind of all the time. So that stress where you never really get much relief from it. So a situation like, say, going to school every day and knowing that none of the other kids in your class want to play with you and want to sit with you, and that you're probably not getting invited to any of their birthday parties. That's the kind of thing that puts kids at more risk than, say, being in a bad car accident. Anxiety and depression in the family, sorry, but we've all got anxiety and depression in the family. I mean, statistically speaking, a bunch of us in this room have struggled with depression or anxiety at particular times in our lives. That's just the way we're made. Of course, learning and attentional disabilities put our kids at higher risk. Anxiety is highly comorbid with attention deficit disorder. To a large extent, they feed off of each other, because when kids are having trouble focusing their attention and controlling it, it's really hard to ignore all of those little ruminating ideas like, I'm going to fail, I'm going to fail, I'm going to fail, I'm going to fail. Bullying, rejection, and exclusion. Back in the day, we didn't think too much about this. You know, as part of growing up, that was just what you dealt with. Tough it out, it will make you stronger in the end. Well, no, it doesn't. It puts kids at much higher risk for depression and even for suicidal ideation, and sometimes even for making gestures or carrying out acts of self-harm. These things are really detrimental, and in part because they're chronic, they happen for long periods of time, and they shape the way that kids think about themselves and think about the world and interact with their environment. Obviously, social isolation is a big risk factor. Conflict and chaos in the home. It's not just that parents getting divorced is necessarily a risk factor. The really bad thing for kids is if they're seeing a lot of screaming and arguing. I hate your mother, well, your father's a drunk, da da da. That's the kind of thing that really places our kids at risk. Look at those two. Look how happy they are. They must have like such a great mother. So what outside of the child? The greatest thing you can give your child is secure attachment to the caregiver. It doesn't matter if the caregiver is grandma, Uncle Bob, or even some really great teachers. That sense that there's an adult in your life who thinks you are just the greatest thing to ever happen ever. The kind of person who would throw themselves under a train for you in a heartbeat. We talked about predictability. Your house doesn't have to be clean, thank God. But it has to be fairly predictable. Kids have to know that they're safe and they're going to get fed. I'm pretty sure you guys have taken care of that. I ordered pizza. I don't know about you. Our parenting style, if we can be fairly flexible, but we got to win all the battles. We don't win them through bullying means or being dictatorship types of parents, but I win. Doesn't matter how, but I'm going to win. And being engaged with other people really fosters resilience. So for those kids, let's say, who were going to another school and maybe they didn't have any friends, and then they came here and for the first time they were able to calm down enough where they could make other friends, having one friend. There's a huge difference between having 0 friends and having 1 friend. You can have 50 friends, and our kids have thousands of Facebook friends, but if you just have 1 friend, that puts you in such better stead, according to the research, in terms of predicting how mentally healthy you're going to be. There you go. Little baby alien says, to the world's greatest mom from your loving boy. He's, of course, kind of. It's really important that our kids see in our eyes, maybe that we're irritated with them or we don't like what they've done, but they know that deep down, that core love is there. So when we think about how kids cope, there's adaptive coping strategies. Oh, I'm so stressed, I'll go for a 3-mile run. Maybe. But the maladaptive coping strategies, a lot of the kids who come here, of course, have to unlearn a lot of things that they've done to survive in other settings before they got here. These provide short-term relief at long-term cost. Smoking is a great example. Overeating is a great example. These things, the reason that we cope with these sorts of things is because they work. They provide us with some short-term relief. You go home after a rough day, drink 3 glasses of wine, I guarantee you're going to feel better for a little while. You're not going to feel much better the next morning, and it's certainly not going to be a good thing if you're coming home every night and having 3 glasses of wine, and pretty soon that's the only way you can get through the evening. But the reason everybody starts is because they do bring relief. Things like cutting, for example. Adults are very upset, why would a child cut themselves? The reason they do it is because it brings them some relief. And that's why a lot of these maladaptive coping strategies are so hard to get rid of, because these kids have found a way to make themselves feel better. And a lot of them, again, they're very rigid. And we need our kids to be flexible, because you never know what's coming down the pike in your life. Zombie apocalypse, you gotta be prepared for all of this. And of course, maladaptive coping, cussing out your teacher to get out of reading, that used to be some of my kids' MO. It makes the problem worse over time. And of course, it allows you to avoid dealing with it. Now, if our kids avoid dealing with problems, this makes them less resilient over time because they don't develop the skills they need to solve problems effectively. And when we talk about intrinsic, that means part of you as a person. Certainly self-efficacy, that's the sense of I can do it, that sense of being competent. Mindfulness and insight, I know that you all are doing a lot of work here around that being able to step back and say, why am I doing this? Is this what I want to be doing? Does this make sense? Is this a good thing for me? It's sort of a repackaged version of Freud's insight, but now they've actually tested it with research and found that you can teach people how to be mindful, and that will actually have a lot of good benefit for their lives. Temperament we can't do much about, but we can teach kids to cope with different temperaments, and we can teach parents to cope with different temperaments. The trick is when you have a particular type of temperament and your kid has a very different type of temperament. And we'll talk more in the end about finding meaning in setbacks. So, this quote, be the change you want to see in the world. Jung, the analyst, said if there's anything we want to change about a child, we should first ask if we can change it about ourselves. So, more mommy guilt for all of us. They watch everything we do, and one of the best ways we can teach our kids to be resilient is to respond in healthy ways, even though we may not want to stress. If you come home after a bad day, God damn it, where's my wine? I need a cigarette. That's what your kids are going to do. Now, obviously, that's probably not what most of us are doing. Most of us are probably pretty healthy, or else you'd be home with your wine right now. But we have to think, too, about how we talk about ourselves. Oh, I'm such an idiot. I can't believe I did that. Oh, I'm terrible at this. Oh, I'm just so stupid. Our kids will internalize that, and then, of course, just like they pretended to talk on the phone like you did and pretended to stir soup the way you do, they're going to cope with adversity the way you do. Chaim Ginott is one of my favorite psychologists. He's from way back in the 60s. And one of the things that he did was come up with a way of understanding how we parent, with the goal not being let's control our children, but with the goal being let's teach our kids to be a mensch, which is basically a word that means a good man, good person. And so what his gist of it is that it comes down to me, the parent, or the teacher. You remember the old t-shirts and bumper stickers from the 80s when mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy? Well, it's very true. In my house, because I'm the one spending more hours with the kids, it's my emotional tone that decides whether everyone's going to have a really nice night or a really kind of horrible night. And so I often have to step back and say to myself, if I can get myself under control, they're going to have themselves under control. So it takes a lot of work, but if we sort of keep that in mind, sort of hold that ideal in mind, that the kids are looking to you to support their ego functioning, then I can be a tool of torture or an instrument of inspiration. And it's so true. We can be Mommy Dearest or Mahatma Gandhi any day. So we have emotions, or reactions to emotional distress that are physical in our body, emotional in terms of how we feel, and cognitive. The important thing, if you remember, the amygdala sets off the alarm, the rest of the brain decides how to interpret that information and whether to keep the threat arousal level going. So what becomes absolutely crucial is how do we interpret what we experience? Our interpretation is very powerful. Anybody see something pretty? Raise your hand if you see something ugly and scary. So if you're not used to seeing this one before, I stole this from Fat City, which if you're familiar with is a dyslexia simulation that came out in the 80s. So if you look at this, here's a woman looking in the mirror and she's at her vanity table. The title of this is Vanity, but it's also an illusion because this is a skull and these are the two eyes and here are the teeth. So it was supposed to be showing how deadly vanity could be. I guess in the days of corsets that was probably true. But how we perceive things has a lot to do with how we react and how mentally healthy we can be in adapting to them. And this is one of my favorites. It says defeat. For every winner there are dozens of losers. Odds are you're one of them. And I really love this. I was given this framed as a print by my roommate when I got my master's degree, and I thought that was just terrific because you might be all proud of yourself when you get a master's degree, and here he was kind of like, I lived with a bunch of people at the time, so not living in sin. But it was, I thought just the perfect snarky little takedown. And so the reason I always put this in is because there's only going to be one winner. There's only going to be one person who's the best at any kind of contest. And our kids get used to the idea of that you have to win things. But that's not true at all. If you run marathons, you don't generally run it because you think you're going to win. I mean, maybe some of you do here. When I used to run, I, believe me, had no illusions that I was going to be faster than anybody else. But the important thing is, just because you're not winning doesn't mean that your struggle was then not valuable, and doesn't mean that you didn't gain a lot from that experience. These are examples of cognitive distortions. So when I talk about, does our brain calm itself down or does it fan the flames of anxiety and depression? Cognitive distortions, if you've ever been in cognitive behavioral therapy, don't raise your hand, are things that you learned a lot about. One of the things that we tend to do is we have what are called automatic negative thoughts, and the abbreviation for that is ANTS. And my friend Dr. Steve Pfeiffer, he talks about how he tells kids that their brains are crawling with ants. Automatic negative thoughts, not real ants. So a lot of what kids tell themselves about what they experience actually raises their anxiety level and makes them feel depressed and angsty and unhappy. One of the things our younger kids tend to do a lot, because they're still very concrete thinkers, is very much all or nothing sorts of thinking. I didn't get invited to Susie's party, that means I have no friends. I didn't win the race, that means I suck. I didn't get an A on this test, that means I'm terrible in math. And they tend to do a lot of catastrophizing. Teenagers are really good at catastrophizing. One little event happens and all of a sudden they take that small event to the worst possible conclusion that could ever possibly happen. I failed this test, so I'm going to bomb my SATs, I'm never going to get into college, then I'll be a complete loser and I'll have to live with you. In terms of how our brains work, we do tend to focus on the bad things, and if you think about it, it's pretty adaptive because, if there's a monster coming to eat you, big saber-toothed cat, you want to pay attention to that. Back in the caveman days, we evolved to focus in on the bad things, the things that could kill us, make us sick, make our spouse leave us, get our children killed, and so our brains tend to pay a lot more attention to bad things. And it's much harder to unlearn negative associations than it is to develop positive ones. So I use the example that I like from the McLean school talk about how you have your wounded ducks coming in. And your wounded ducks, the teachers have a very tough road ahead of them because not only do they need to take these kids who haven't been successful and get them caught up and get them achieving at their potential, they've also got to help these kids unlearn years of things that they've internalized about failure and their own capability and how well they could do and whether or not school could be nice or not. So in terms of bouncing back, resilience is about being flexible. It's not about being John Wayne and going around kicking people's backsides and shooting them and doing all of that. We are most resilient when we're flexible. A really resilient person doesn't have to have his or her way to be okay. A really resilient person can make do with what's there. I mean, if you think about Anne Frank, for example, if you've ever read her diary, it's just astounding, the fact that she was down to so little in her life, and yet she was still able to find joy in day-to-day existence when the whole world was crashing around her. So then you've got our little Aesop quote from simplyspiritualliving.org. Very nice. Now, one thing I'm not going to do is I'm not going to talk about how we're all terrible parents and how we're all helicopter parents and how this generation of kids is so inadequate because they're not as tough as we used to be back in the good old days. I think every generation envies the generation before, envies the up-and-coming generation. I mean, in part because they're still thin and really good-looking. But there's also the fact that, you know, as technology advances, and in this country, as our standard of living is really quite good, you know, there's a lot of things that we had to do and put up with that our kids will never have to deal with and put up with. Remember what a big deal it was to get a flat tire before cell phones? Or to be like out with your parents at the mall and you got to go to the Limited by yourself and then you couldn't find them afterwards. Remember those days? We had to solve all those problems. Did that necessarily make me a better person? Probably not. But I'm a big believer that with a lot of these changes, there's things that are lost, but there's also things that are gained. And to my way of thinking, a lot of our kids now have a lot greater empathy and sense of justice and sense of really caring about fairness and treating other people right. And I'm very encouraged about seeing that in this generation of kids coming up. It's very exciting. Did anybody recycle when we were kids? Nah, we just threw it in the trash can. People still threw trash on the ground. So I think there are good things happening with the changes. But I also see that in a lot of the media, one of the things that gets covered the most is how all of us, particularly moms, are so terrible. If you get HuffPo, Feed, Huffington Post, or pretty much any mainstream media outlet, The Atlantic, that thinks a lot of women are reading, boy, they trash us moms. We're terrible. We need to make our kids tough. We are helicopters. We're all up in their business. There's times when our kids really do need us. And being in a psychology practice, I see kids where the parents have actually not been helicoptering. They've been staying out of situations and letting situations go too long. So I don't usually see people coming in saying, Dr. Resnik, we'd like to pay you thousands of dollars to test our child and nothing's really wrong. I would love to see those families. If you know any of those, you can send them right over to me. But generally people have been waiting and worrying about a situation for a long time and been afraid not knowing what to do. So I would love to see an article come through Huffington Post that says like, parents, you're probably fine. You're probably good enough. But nobody's gonna read that and nobody's gonna write that because that doesn't sell advertising. So in terms of the research on resilience, one of the things that we can do for our children, if we want them to be resilient, is help them to develop a sense of personal efficacy, that sense of being competent. And one of my favorite ways to do that is to make them do chores. Chores are good. My stepson, when I first started parenting him, he was in a joint custody situation. So his father didn't get to see much of him. His mother didn't get to see much of him because she was in school. He had no chores. And I was like, what? So the evil stepmother started making him do laundry and walk the dog. I was real popular there for a while. But now he is very resilient and he's very competent. And he does everything for himself and cooks for himself. I think it's great. So I suffered in the beginning, but that's okay. One of the things we can do for our kids that we don't often do is give them choices, even little choices. You want to use the blue sippy cup or the red sippy cup. And that's a big deal when you're 3 years old, right? Because, you got to think about that one a little bit. But a lot of times we know how to do things. I'm 40. I've been doing a lot of these things like picking my own cup now for quite some time. I've been spelling words for a long time, driving cars. When I start to think about how long I've been doing a lot of these things now, it's a little disturbing. But we often just rush in and say, oh, let me do it, for God's sake, we've got to go to work. And so we don't let our kids spend, like 20 minutes trying to tie their own shoes. Or we don't let them sit and try to figure out how to do a math problem. So we're often in such a hurry to cram so much information into them or to get on the beltway before the traffic picks up that we're often just jumping in and doing it all for them. And sometimes it's really hard to pull back and let them flounder for a little bit. Allowing our kids to invent solutions, particularly in mathematics. I was trained in constructivist math. Didn't help my special ed kids very much, but by the time they got in high school. But a lot of times kids will come up with very interesting solutions to problems if we can stand to watch them struggle for a little while. Now I'm not talking about letting them get frustrated until they're in tears, but giving them that time and space to work it out Wendy Mogul, in her book, The Blessing of Skin Knee, which I really recommend, it's a wonderful book about taking Jewish teachings and bringing them to bear on parenting. And even if you're a Gentile like I am, you can still really enjoy it because there's a lot of wisdom there. Wendy talks about how you need to take a look at your neighborhood and see what the kids are allowed to do, and let your kids do the same, within reason, if they're able enough. Try and let them have the same level of freedom that the other kids in the neighborhood have. I'm not talking about letting your kids like wander loose for 8 hours at a time with no cell phone. But if the neighborhood standard is letting the kid, bike over to a friend's house that's a mile away, maybe it's okay to do that. You can take precaution, put a cell phone on them, have a tracker installed in them. I'm into that. But a lot of times giving our kids responsibilities. So we have a vet that comes to our house and takes care of our dog, and when he comes to the door, you would think it was the second coming of Jesus. The kids are so excited to have him there because he lets them help with the veterinary exam. They have jobs. They have to calm the dog. They have to, pet her. He lets them push the plunger for the shots. But they really see that as like they have to help Dr. Pearl. They love it. Oh, and natural consequences. No, I'm not talking about the kind of natural consequences like, well, Timmy, I told you not to run in front of that truck. I'm talking about the kind of thing where, Timmy, remember your lunch. Timmy, I'm only going to remind you one more time. You need to bring your lunch to school. Oops, there he goes. He didn't bring his lunch to school. Am I going to run chasing after him? Am I going to drive over to school? Maybe sometimes, maybe the first time. But am I going to do that every time? Heck no, because then Timmy, this fantasy child I have in my head, is never going to take responsibility for bringing his own lunch. So what Timmy needs to experience is having to go down to the lunch lady and borrow the money and write that letter of apology or whatever it is that the school makes them do, or maybe borrow some extra food from friends. There are a lot of little natural consequences in this world, and we can look for the opportunities for our kids to experience, well, you didn't want to wear your coat and you wanted to wear shorts and it was 13 degrees. Okay, let's see how that works out for you. Now, maybe you stash a coat in the trunk so you can be the great hero, but maybe you don't. Maybe you're tired of having that battle every morning. For gosh sakes, basketball shorts, 13 degrees, could you please put on a coat? They'll learn. And if they're not cold, guess what? They're not cold. These are the guys from Mythbusters. And one of the reasons I really like Mythbusters and books, like Anne of Green Gables, other books where the characters have to overcome failure through perseverance, a lot of perseverance. These guys basically blow things up every episode of their show, and so my 7-year-old loves it, and I admit I like it too. And one of the things they always say is failure is always an option. They spend the whole hour of the show basically trying to do something and failing at it, and trying a new way and failing at it, and laughing about it, and coming up with new solutions. These guys are the kind of guys I want my son to think about when he thinks about like what it's like to be a dude. Somebody who really perseveres and is creative and is nice and funny to boot. And for our girls, there are a lot of things out there where the girl characters are not just worried about, waiting for Prince Charming to come. There's a lot of books out there, like A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, Anne of Green Gables, a lot of the older stuff that we grew up on, where it's teaching girls a lot about, overcoming problems. Now, every now and then, of course, if we let them, our children are going to have failures. They're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. And I know I just said that in Potomac. It is okay for our kids to fail an occasional test. It's okay for them not to turn their homework. I'm waiting for the stones to start flying past my head. It's okay if a kid gets a C. If there's not an 800 on the math SAT, life will go on. One of the things we can do when our kids have those times of failures, and even very little children, is you can validate it. The feelings are never wrong. Hey, you look upset. You look stressed. Did you have a bad day? You look a little sad. It's very relieving for children to have an adult come in and name the feeling. And they'll tell you if you're wrong. I'm not sad. I'm mad at that stupid teacher. Da, 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 da. You know what I just did? I was wrong, but I got my kid talking and telling me how he felt, and that's what I want. So the feelings are never wrong. It also helps kids a lot because they don't often know what they're feeling, especially younger kids. So if you say to them, you look sad, it's like when you go into the doctor and the doctor says, yep, it's strep, or yes, foot and mouth disease, or pink eye. You immediately, it's not like you're happy to have pink eye, but it's a relief when you find out, okay, this is what I have. Somebody knows what this is. Same for our kids. And so a lot of what we can do as parents is guide the child to find their own solution. And I'm a big fan of having kids make retribution if they mess up. So one of the things we do at my house is if I walk into the bathroom and I don't like what I see, remember I'm the only girl in the house, I will hand the guilty party a roll of paper towels and a spray bottle and have them go make retribution for whatever happened in there. Making retributions is very, very powerful. Going back and saying I'm sorry, or fixing a bad situation, or if you broke something, saving up and paying for it. What has that got to do with resilience? A lot, because kids start to understand that they have the power, even if they fail, to try and make it better and make it okay. And that's a really powerful thing to teach our kids. And this is one of my little sayings, think like a coach, not a mechanic. When you go to a mechanic, they take your car, you say what's wrong with the car, and you're upset about it maybe, and the mechanic says sure, 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 and they take the car back into a room and they do God knows what with it, and you get it back in a couple days and they hand you a bill for $500 and you drive away. This is not an empowering sort of situation. I have no idea what they do to my car. It might be nothing. I know I paid the bill. But what we often do with our kids' problems is we act like a mechanic and we jump in to fix it. And we need to think more like a coach. So not Ditka, more like Mr. Miyagi. You know, where you're sort of sculpting, I know you're all over the age where you know Mr. Miyagi. We need to help sculpt them with suggestions, perspective, giving them feedback, but helping them find their own solutions. And encouraging our girls in particular to take risks. If you read studies about how girls, or how women take risks at work, we get dinged a lot more when we take a risk and it doesn't work out. Whereas men, it's often it's often chalked up to, oh, well, he screwed up once, but he's such a great guy, we're gonna let that one slide. And of course, particularly for women of color, women of different nationalities and ethnicities, taking a risk is even more risky. And so for our girls, they need to understand that it's okay to do that and you can recover from taking a risk. Even if it doesn't work out, you're going to have learned something. And one of the things that I often do that sometimes drives my kids crazy is I say, what's your plan? If things didn't go the way they want, Ross Greene has a wonderful method called the collaborative problem-solving approach, where you say to them, so you look sad about that. What's up? And then you shut up for a little bit. That's the hard part. So I think in terms of timing, I better get a move on here. Dr. Angela Duckworth, it's not fair that she's so brilliant and so pretty. Her research is all on grit. And when she's talking about grit, she's talking about perseverance and passion for long-term goals, things like getting through medical school, graduating from a military academy, learning math. And so one of the things that she's been studying is why are some people able to persevere whereas other people give up? Because giving up most of the time is a completely rational choice. If I decided to try to become a Formula One race car driver at age 40 when I can barely drive my minivan, that wouldn't be a very appropriate goal. Giving up would be perfectly rational. But a lot of times our kids don't have the option to give up if they're going to achieve their goals. And so in her research, grit is much more significant than IQ. And I know you're all thinking, well, I mean, for everybody else's kid who isn't as smart as mine. But one of the things we often find with kids who are very bright, particularly your GTLD population, is that they're often very risk averse. They don't want to take a chance, they don't want to look dumb, because they feel like if it doesn't come easy to them, then that threatens their whole little worldview of, I've got this one thing to cling to about myself. I can't read, but I know I'm smart, and I'm not going to threaten that. Dr. Carol Dweck has come up with what she calls the growth mindset. Most of us have a fixed mindset, and particularly kids, they're so concrete. I'm good at math, I'm not good at reading. I'm good at soccer, I'm not good at lacrosse. And what Dweck and Duckworth are actually both saying is that a lot of these things are not in fact fixed, but they're variable. And we can change a lot of things about ourselves. Maybe I can't be amazing at calculus, but maybe I can be a heck of a lot better at mathematics than I am right now. And I used to think I was terrible at mathematics, and then I got to statistics, and I was like, oh, here's a kind of math that makes sense to me. And it was okay. I was willing to work at statistics. Algebra 2, nope, forget it. And paying attention to this central part, here's our GTLD kids in the middle. They have a certain amount, and that's that, and their goal becomes to look smart all the time and never look dumb. And so for our little kids, they don't want to take a risk. They don't want to try to persevere. They would rather avoid a problem than actually dig in and understand that it's going to take a lot of frustration and a lot of perseverance to get better, but that doesn't mean it's not worth doing, and it doesn't mean you can't do it. Just because it's hard doesn't mean you can't do it. Really, really quickly, when we praise our kids, Chaim Gunot, the psychologist, likened praise to penicillin. Use it sparingly because it's very, very powerful. But when we praise, we often praise our kids, you're so smart. I know you could do this because you're so smart. Well, does that mean if I can't do it that I'm not actually as smart as you think I am, Mom? Probably. We need to praise what we want our kids to do. And we can praise gritty attributes. I will always praise hard work with my kids. I will tell them they're smart because I can't help it. But when my son brings home a math paper, the first thing I will always train myself to say is, this looks like a lot of hard work. How was this for you? How did you do this? So again, we want to focus in on what we want to see. Strategic praise, we're trying to build an internal model in our child's mind of who he or she can become. And we can do this with little kids, and we can do this with teenagers. The more they hear about how we're seeing them in terms of, you were really determined. You took care of that all by yourself. I can't believe you didn't even need any help with that. You remembered all by yourself. I'm going to strategically praise what I want to see, and I'm going to praise those character attributes that I want them to be developing. And in time for Passover, finding meaning in your own story. So one of the things, my husband is Jewish, and I really like about Judaism is that the Jews have had it rough, to put it mildly. Any horrible thing you can imagine, has happened to the Jews, and of course the Jews are not alone in that unlucky boat. But one of the things the Jews have really done that I find very interesting, just picking this example because I know it, of course, is there's a lot of finding meaning in all of the bad stuff that's happened to you and using it to strengthen your community and your sense of identity as a person. And we can take this and do this for our kids. So when we find meaning in our own story, if you think about the Passover Seder, the whole thing is about finding meaning in whether or not it's historically accurate, this whole story about all of these terrible things that happen to people. And so when we find meaning in it, when we find meaning in the fact that, yes, I'm dyslexic, and that's part of who I am, and that's part of my story, and I've had to overcome it. It was twice as hard for me to learn to read, but I did it. That's a much more powerful message than the kid who feels ashamed to say, I'm dyslexic. We can be the repository of our child's finest moments. I love that. I took that from Faber and Maslish, who wrote the book, How to Talk So Kids Will Listen and Listen So Kids Will Talk. Because who our kids are, their story as it unfolds is made up of all the good things that happened to them, the time when they won first prize, but it's also made up of all the times they had to struggle and all the times that they solved a problem. My story, part of it is the time I stepped on broken glass and I pulled it out of the bottom of my foot and I walked all the way home. Back in the old days when we walked on broken glass because we were going barefoot. But I was very proud of that as a young child, that I had not just sat there crying. So all of these little things, when we think about who our children are, we can tell this back to them because they love to hear how they look through our eyes. You know, I remember that time when you spilled the drink and you ran and got the cloth from off the oven before it touched the work I was doing. That was great. And I'm going to tell that story 50 times, even though it's not an exciting story to you all. My 8-year-old loves it. And we can also make this art. We can also come up with ways to make all of the bad things that have happened to us something that has meaning and symbolic value for us, and we can share with other people too. And I'll leave, I think this is the end. This is Andrew Solomon, the guy with the dark hair. He looks so happy. He suffered his whole life from depression. He wrote a book called The Noonday Demon, which is fantastic if you ever get the chance to read it. And he also studied families of children who have disabilities and differences. And the thing he talks about in his work is that the families who make it intact, with their souls intact, who don't succumb to bitterness and depression, are the ones who find meaning in the struggle, meaning in the difference. You know, what does it mean to your family that one of our children has Down syndrome? Or what does it mean that one of our children was adopted from Russia? Who are we because of that? And what does it do to our story? Remember, you're the child's primary mental health care provider. So somebody's doing a great job there. This was the bribe. If they would pose for the good-looking picture, I would allow them to have this picture taken. There's nobody who's going to influence them more. You can take them to as much therapy as you want. They're going to learn much more from you. And finally, if you do find that your child's starting to get too much anxiety, too much depression, there's no shame in going to a psychologist or a mental health care provider or a counselor. A lot of people, when they come to see me, they feel like they must have failed. They're coming in there and like, oh, I've tried so hard to avoid this. I did not want to be here. I feel like I failed as a parent. I've had mothers cry. And nobody cries when they go get their hair cut. I can't cut my own hair. I feel so bad about this. You know, I don't cry when I get the lawyer to do my taxes. I'm thrilled. There's a lot of things I can't do for myself. And so sometimes you get into situations where you need extra help. That's what all these people are here for. So there's no shame in knowing when to get help. And that's it.